Hello and welcome to the New Voice of Ukraine's series of questions and answers interviews, where we speak to either our own journalists or, in this case, special guests to speak on some related topic that's relevant this month or this week. This week, we're speaking to Dr. Kari, a experienced political analyst who has been working in Ukraine, including with me in previous jobs. So this is nice to speak to an old friend on this one. She was at the Munich Security Conference, a conference that happens every year. Well, we'll get into more detail what it is specifically. But this year, Vice President Vance of the United States gave a speech that kind of sent shockwaves through the European security establishment. So we'll be speaking on that as well as other things that came up during the course of the conference. So, Kari, welcome.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you for sharing your audience with me. I'm a longtime fan of your podcast and the work you do for the New Voice. So I feel like I've really reached a certain point now that I finally get on your show.
Wonderful. It's nice to have you. Can you introduce yourself in your own words? What's your experience dealing with the issues of politics, political communications, etc.?
Well, I'm a political scientist and I explain politics to people with multi-layered messaging. That means I do a lot on social media and I look for entry points for democratic resilience. It started out during COVID, really, while I was living in Kyiv. I had missed going on air. I'd been working as an English language news anchor in Ukraine for several years, where you and I got to work together in some situations. And I turned over to social media. I was on TikTok. My following on TikTok and now Instagram has grown. And I talk a lot about Ukraine. I talk a lot about security issues. And I inform people where they already get their information, where they're already consuming content. And that's really important, especially right now.
So, yeah, very important at the moment. Lots of disinformation, all that, information hygiene. Not what we're talking about this week, but maybe slate you later on those things as well. What we're talking about this week is the Munich Security Conference. Security conferences, most of the time, quite boring, to be honest. I'm saying this as I'm signing up to hopefully go to one in Kyiv. It's coming up shortly. But usually you don't see too much crazy stuff. This year, however, Vance kind of surprised everyone. But first, can you give a primer on what the Munich Security Conference is and the kind of topics that are usually discussed?
Well, the Munich Security Conference has been happening for 61 years. And although it happens in the southern Bavarian capital, Munich, it is really turned into a global event. It is usually an event where the US vice president shows up. And the appearance of the US vice president is probably the highest ranking person there, although other countries do send their state leaders. And the thing about Munich is its motto has always been peace through dialogue. And it happens either kind of between the Super Bowl in the United States and Valentine's Day. And those two things kind of really explain what the MSC is. They have something called matchmaking there. And because the Munich Security Conference isn't an official state event, certain protocol doesn't apply. And this makes it so important for groups to meet. And official participants of the event get an app, and there's something called the bilateral desk. And this bilat desk then connects people almost a little bit like a political Tinder. So we've got a delegation from one country wanting to speak to another country. If there's a match, they will then have a certain amount of time in this hotel, Bayerischer Hof, which is a really traditional hotel, which is taken over for about 4 days during the event. There's a hair salon that's turned into a YouTube studio. There's a jewelry store that I think is turned into a meeting point. And all of these hotel rooms are booked and turned into conference rooms. On the top floor, they've got a studio and they've also got a lot of security. Something I wasn't aware of is often when major delegations are coming in, they'll have helicopter flying over, which will jam all cell phone signals. US actually rents a building across the street from this hotel. And that's where they have their main base. And that's where J.D. Vance walked out of when he gave his speech on Valentine's Day on February 14th. And people were prepared for a speech about security because that's what the Munich Security Conference is all about. But he didn't.
He even referenced that at the start because the beginning of the speech, he's like, "Oh, I know you're usually here to talk about, number of tanks or whatever his quote was, but here's this."
Yeah. And what was this? He really dished out. He was really critical of Europe and the German hosts in general. He was allowed to say whatever he wanted. What was surprising is what happened while he was giving his speech. He was offered courteous applause when he walked up to the podium on the main stage. And then, as he really began unrolling his speech, the German Minister of Defense, a person named Boris Pistorius, who is really straight-laced. I mean, he's the Minister of Defense.
Mhm.
He actually shouted. He said, "This is unacceptable," which is completely out of character for him and shows you how surprised people were with the way Vance approached having the keynote address this day. Now, a lot of people will say they shouldn't have been surprised because Trump and then Biden and now Trump again have been saying that the European
Well,
nations.
well, before we go on, we should probably explain what exactly he was saying. Like, what was the content of this speech?
What I thought was most surprising, what I understood as most surprising, was the fact that he was criticizing Europeans for their understanding of democracy. And he especially focused on freedom of speech in Germany. That was really interesting because right now we're just days before a parliamentary election in Germany. And at this event, the organizers had opted not to allow two of the parties in Germany to attend the event. Now, normally, because this event in its timing, if there is a German election coming up after this event, a lot of people are being show ponies, trying to have this moment where they can address the domestic German audience and show how well they would be on the internet, how well they could perform on the international stage. So this is something that could really help the parties position themselves. And that the Sarah Wagenknecht Bündnis, which is considered far left, and the Alternative for Deutschland, the AfD, which is considered a far right party, weren't invited, is actually connected to Ukraine and Zelensky. When Zelensky visited the German parliament this summer, in the summer of 2024, the members of this party either didn't show up or walked out. And the Munich Security Conference organizers, they made a note of this. And then they said that especially the AfD did not represent this peace through dialogue by walking out. So
Mm.
they weren't invited. And that's what Vance criticized, because many German politicians have also said that they're not willing to cooperate with this far right party if they get elected. The thing is, there's a big problem with threat perceptions in Europe and also within German society. And the AfD has really what seems like close ties or a close alignment with Russian talking points. And there's a worry that if they would be elected, that it would be to Ukraine's deficit. And Vance.
Well, we don't really have to mince words on that. The AfD took part in. We have video here, so I can do the proper air quotes.
Okay.
Election monitoring in Crimea during that referendum. They are frequently guests of the Kremlin for various conferences and such. Their party messaging is often boosted by Kremlin-sponsored and directed media outlets. They are a Kremlin-connected party. We don't need to be too polite with them.
And that's what was so shocking, though, because Vance then criticized the established German parties for not wanting to cooperate with the AfD and said that, it wasn't democratic what was happening by excluding, obviously, what people in Germany want. And this confused a lot of people. And we can come back to the speech in a minute, but also
Mhm.
there was a lot of stage setting happening there. Vance then refused to visit the current German chancellor, Olaf Scholz. They should have, according to protocol, have a meeting. And he then instead went and visited with Alice Weidel, who is the co-chair of the AfD. again, aligning himself with what Elon Musk had said the week before in his support, which was also analyzed by a lot of people at the conference, why Vance would really want to be so in harmony with Elon Musk and what that should be interpreted as.
And the other element that I noted, it wasn't stated directly, but he did refer to something about elections and not allowing elections, and that was a very
Oh, wait,
direct reference.
you're right. Thank you for
That was to
mentioning that.
Romania. That was to Romania.
Mention of Romania, which was really interesting. The fact that that was a TikTok candidate is what I call Colin Georgescu.
Mhm.
The fact that that was mentioned on the main stage at the Munich Security Conference was kind of surprising, but it's almost as though he was looking for an example where he could really show that Europe was silencing people's democratic wishes.
Mhm.
At the same time, it was like a collection of poorly knitted together examples to justify his criticism of Europe in general.
Yeah, and just for context, Romania had recently had a presidential election, where the candidate that came in first place in Romania, they have
They
a
have 2
runoff
rounds, yeah.
election. You have multiple candidates. The top two in the first round go on to the second round. One of the candidates that passed to the second round, Ceausescu, he was like I said, the TikTok candidate, and he was accused of basically being the Russia supported and Russia like pushing his messaging on the people. So the Supreme Court of Romania nullified his candidacy. When the next election happens, I want to say next month. I'm not going to check that right now.
They
He
they
is
really
being
put the brakes
excluded.
on it. Yeah,
Yeah.
they really put the brakes on it, and the problem was to get the amount of followers and views that he did in relationship to how many people are actually in Romania and how many people actually have TikTok accounts was quite impressive. So there was enough evidence that said that there was external funding and maybe some external support, either from these trolling these accounts and bots that really pushed the algorithm to get his message out. And that's not fair according to Romanian rules, but that was
Mhm.
criticized. The other thing that seems to be a big talking point, and I honestly don't recall if it was mentioned in the Vance speech, is this 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 topic again of Ukrainian elections. And it seems to be that there's a memo that's sent out and says we're going to talk about this week. And this has been something that in the past 7 days I have heard remarkably this many times as compared to the 2 weeks before. This argument that Ukraine is also not a democratic country right now.
Yeah, I don't think I just listened to it before we had this as well. I don't think that was in the speech. The Ukraine election talking point came out like 3 days afterwards. It's been a very busy week. I was actually kind of worried about that because when I contacted you, the security conference was a thing on everyone's lips. And since then, the deterioration between the US and Ukraine has really kind of taken over the news cycle. So I'm like, oh, I hope that the Munich Security Conference is still something that people are afraid of now. But so it goes. Things have
You
to
know,
be scheduled.
but it's what's really interesting for me is, and I've spoken with several people about it in the meantime also, is while you're there, you go, huh, what's going on? And you did mention you'd want to talk to me a little bit about the vibe. And that was the first time I had been at the MSC. But now, after the event, I've talked to people that had been there several times, and they said it was a completely different vibe. And
Yeah, so that was my next question. Like what was the vibe in the building like as it was happening and in the hours afterwards?
Anthony, you remember, I know you remember when Russia launched the full scale invasion. And there were a lot of people.
Yes.
Yep. There were a lot of people in Kyiv that were like, did this really happen? Is this is this really happening right now? And there were people that should have gone to the train station, but they were trying to book tickets in advance because that's what you do, right? Because
Mhm.
by admitting this was really happening, you also would be confronted with some really scary realities. And that seems to have been a little bit, and I hope that wasn't an insensitive analogy, but that seems to be a little bit of what was happening at the MSC in terms of, is this really happening? No, this didn't really happen. No, no. And now these days later, people look back and go, this was probably pivot of history. This is something that we're going to look back on as the point where US relationship with Europe has changed, that United States may have given away their bargaining chips for a lot of things with Russia before the poker game even started, and that China might come away as the winner here. These are some of the conversations I've had.
Mhm.
Because I hadn't been there in the past, I really couldn't compare, but there was a buzz. There was a lot of, "What do you think he meant by that? Where is this gonna go? What does this mean for us?"
Yeah, quite honestly, I was thinking that one of the things that was a very important part of the development of Vladimir Putin and Putinism was the 2007 Munich Security Conference,
Yeah.
where he gave this speech of we have to respect Russia, but we're not being like treated properly, and his whole list of complaints that he had about Europe. And then in 2008, just the year after that, was the invasion of Georgia. So
They're
I don't
crazy.
know I don't know how of a direct comparison this may be, but the Munich Security Conference used by Putin to basically declare his separation away from Europe politically, although that's something that was looked back at the time. There was many years after that where such a rupture didn't actually take place. There was resets and all that. But now to the United States kind of doing the same thing of we our interests, our ideological interests, because that's how he framed it as his as American values not being shared by Europe really kind of struck me as history rhyming in that way. I don't know if anyone at the conference really took note of that at the time.
Yes. People were talking about how this is a different kind of wake-up call. 2007 speech is often referred to as Putin's wake-up call for the West. And we know the West hits snooze several times before that was really understood. As a political analyst, I look at things and what is to be gained from this is really you got to believe what people say, right? And I don't think that Vance was there to try to shock people. I think this might be an attempt to use some type of triangular diplomacy and leverage Europe off Russia or the United States. But I've also spoke with people about that, and they don't understand the strategy behind what the Trump administration is doing right now.
Mm,
So there's a lot of uncertainty. And maybe that is one of the things that did come out of the Munich Security Conference is at least Europe knows where they stand right now.
mhm,
And sadly, though, just the day after, Macron invited European leaders to Paris to discuss the developments. And what came out of that? Another big discussion and things getting lost in committee, and the idea that things had to be discussed a little bit more. But I think the time for discussion is over. I think that there's got to be things done that everyone's spending more than their 2% on defense. And the Maastricht criteria has to be loosened up a little bit, those type of things.
yeah, that was because Europe, what their biggest weakness has always been that everything goes to commit. I mean, biggest strength as well, because it means,
Yeah.
you're following rules and rule of law and all that
Amendment.
stuff. But in a crisis, that means things happen very, very slowly. And the process of consensus building and caution and all that that Europe is famous for right now when the United States is changing things very quickly, that's you need to be able to answer just as quickly or you're left behind. But other than that, before we have some other questions about what Americans can do and all that, but I think it's important to also talk about what were some of the other themes discussed at the Munich Security Conference other than Vance. Was there anything related to Ukraine that stands out a lot more, or
No,
what was
people were
important there?
people were saying, "Oh, all MSC is ever about is Ukraine anymore." There was some criticism of that, which isn't justified. Of course, right now Ukraine is, you know, involved in a war that's right next door, pretty much. So it's a justified comment. It's a justified topic, I should say. Interestingly, I sat in on some talks, some table discussions on AI and automated weapons and
Hmm.
how the US and the West need to really step up and how this is going to be important and how drones and chips are cheap. And if you have automated ones that do what you tell them to do, they can get a lot done. And while in Europe and the United States, we're looking at ways to regulate things that other countries are way ahead of the curve on this. And that's scary for some people. It's also scary to hear them talking about how you can dial up and down certain levels of certainty, right? If you
Mhm.
send a drone swarm out and they get their communications cut off, a human operator, you can say, take the hit if it's 70% certain instead of 99% certain. And there's consequences for that, but it might be more effective in your long term strategy. Those are really somber conversations to be a part of. The other thing, there was some focus on rare earths in general and supply chains, which this was just, I did an interview and this was just 24 hours after the Secretary of the Treasurer showed up in Kyiv with a contract for Zelensky asking about getting 500 billion in rare earth metals. Now we know the deal that was offered wasn't that great, but at the time, Europe and the European Investment Bank, they've been looking at ways to sustainably develop relationships and invest in Ukraine. And then they would be able to have a good supply chains or technology that they need in Europe to also to develop weapon systems. And that was also a topic. I'd ask if, Trump had beaten the EIB to the punch by trying to corner the market right there. And they were rightfully confident in that discussion about, these things take time and to have agreements that benefit both parties. And that's the priority of a lot of European institutions to have agreements that benefit both parties.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, just it taking place in Germany specifically brings up how the company Rheinmetall is
mhm.
opening up several factories in Ukraine, and that will help boost the domestic defense production of Ukraine instead of having to rely more on foreign sources. Was there much discussion on defense investment in that way at the Munich Security Conference?
I think the defense industry is quite comfortable and can comfortably kind of be in the back row at the Munich Security Conference.
Mhm.
It's they do sponsor parts of the event. There's lots of side events. There's no secret that it's still a security conference, although the MSC team does make a big effort to to widen the scope into this human security element where
Hmm.
they talk about women and the environment and energy security and a lot of these topics that are interlinked and really important. Now, the interesting thing about that you mentioned Rheinmetall, you also must know that their CEO, there's been death threats and
An assassination attempt was thwarted.
assassination.
Yeah.
That's right. And I don't think that's a coincidence between Rheinmetall branching out into Ukraine and trying to improve their defense capabilities and defense production capabilities, and that the assassination attempt is directed at their CEO.
Oh, yeah, obviously. And for background, even before the full scale invasion, Russian, I forget the exact name of the team right now, but basically, Russian spies had blown up several defense industry warehouses in both Czechia and Romania. So these kinetic actions, I guess you can call them, against European security firms are nothing new for Russia. So
You
on the
mentioned
human, on
the term
the
for a second, you just used the term kinetic action, and that reminded me of some new vocabulary that I had heard at the
hmm,
MSC, because there's a lot of discussion about hybrid warfare. I noticed that people from the NATO delegation, it's not necessarily trying to make it more palatable, but I think they're trying to make it a little bit more understandable and make security a little bit more attainable for people that maybe aren't, Yankees or whatever the expression is, people that like metal and guns and kinetic stuff.
oh, how so? Like, where's some examples?
they're talking about destabilizing factors now instead of just calling it hybrid warfare. And they may have been talking about that for a while, but I'm into this news scene a lot and this research scene, and it really occurred to me at the security conference that instead of saying hybrid warfare, that was being changed to destabilizing factors, destabilizing factors. I was
Mhm.
happy to see that because that could be one of two things. It could be NATO leaning more towards redefining what triggers Article 5, or it could be NATO distancing it, saying, a destabilizing factor isn't a kinetic, declaration of war,
Right.
right? So that's something I'm gonna be watching, but that was interesting for me. And the other thing is, NATO this summer had their 75th anniversary, and they had a big push to have social media influencers there. And
Mm.
NATO is really trying to make security topics understandable. They also concentrated on content creators from the North American hemisphere, from North America. So this is, to me, something I'm watching, how people are talking about war and security, how people are introducing it to younger people. I think this might be a little bit late for Europe, but it's really important to get people to understand that the threat perception, you have to look the threat in the eye right now and acknowledge it.
Yeah, the whole issue of Europe kind of sleepwalking the threat of Russia for so long has a lot to do with like normal people not really seeing a direct threat to themselves. So, yeah, social media, TikTok is where people get all their information from now. Ukraine, I almost said the wrong thing. New Voice of Ukraine, we do have a TikTok account. We do put out videos. These are usually translated from our Ukrainian language sources, but also some of our own productions. This interview will be cut into clips, turned into TikTok things. We are trying to do our part, though not as engaged with as we would like.
Well, that's really, really
Uh,
important. Make sure you tag me in those. I can push those out
mhm.
because I think this discussion is really important.
So I kind of I'm going to jump ahead to some of these other questions because it is kind of related to this. Is our American president and his staff have chosen the wrong side, which is the side of propaganda? What are the ways that this will affect the relationship between Ukraine and America? Like, how does this information warfare kind of situation? How does information and phrasing choices used by the vice president affect the relationship between not only the country of Ukraine and the country of America, but also Ukrainians and Americans?
Well, it's quite suspicious when they repeat talking points that just come right out of the Kremlin playbook. And it is, if it's not suspicious, it's really unfortunate. You would expect the US administration, to have enough awareness that if they would agree with certain policies, that they would at least change the wording. And I think that I can't imagine how a Ukrainian feels to hear this. I know what it feels like as an American to hear this and wonder, is our president now on Team Russia? And is this the new constellation where it's Russia and the United States? And is this some type of maybe misplaced strategy that they'll go Team Russia and try to form a coalition against China? I don't know. There's so much I don't know. I think we need to focus on what we do know, and it's that Europe and Ukraine really need to work together, and they need to come up with a plan together. I don't think anyone should try to do anything unilaterally. And I think Poland's in a good position maybe to take on a leadership role. I don't see Germany or France doing it. With the elections coming up, you don't know what you're going to get. And Poland has really been putting its money where its mouth is. And Poland is actually showing that this 3% that the EU has argued, they don't want to go into debt because of, I think, the Maastricht convergence criteria is what it's called. Now,
Mm.
Poland doesn't have the euro. Poland's spending its 5% because Poland knows it's really this geographic threat perception and how the needle moves. And the further east you get, people take it seriously. I saw Dmytro Kuleba at the MSC, and he was there. I saw him a lot. And when he was asked to respond to Vance's speech and what the Trump administration was doing in general, he had some pretty good responses. And he just said, it is really easy to draw lines on somebody else's map. but what's on the ground is going to be different than lines that someone's drawing on a map. And like, he was very much applauded for that.
And I guess a follow-up for that last question is, and tie this in with the social media aspects that the conference seems to be pushing, is with all this disinformation, this malicious framing, I'll call it, from the vice president and the current American administration, what are some things that Americans who support Ukraine can do to counteract this very hazardous narrative building? What are some things that Americans can do? What are some things that supporters of Ukraine in Europe can do as well?
I think you're a good example of this. I mean, just this week, I also went on to a Midwestern radio show and also talked about what happened. It's these firsthand, these firsthand stories that give credibility to a lot of things nowadays. People don't know who to trust. So when you can present something as, "Hey, I was in the room when that happened," or you, Anthony, with, this happened down the street for me, and to talk about it. I also think it's really important to find maybe a citizen journalist that you like and share their information. This firsthand information really resonates with people. It's finding commonalities, right? That help people understand things better. It's the stories of families, it's the stories of the fears and anxiety that people can relate to and share. It's finding a way to share these stories, but unfortunately, you still have to make them palatable, right? And
Mhm.
that's a lot to maybe ask for people in Ukraine to tell their story in a nice way, so it gets shared on social media. But this is also where people that support Ukraine, they can talk about how they support Ukraine. The donations to the private people that are doing things, whether it be getting heart medication to grandmas down the street, my friend Helen, who sends vegetables from her vegetable garden to the Ukrainian army on a regular basis from her dacha.
Mhm.
It's things like that you got to keep talking about it. And it's not like some of those situations where someone shows up in your comments and says, "Yeah, what about this?" or "Why aren't you talking about this?" I think that it's okay to have an opinion about things you know about, and you don't have to have an opinion about everything. And you don't also have to share information about everything. Ukraine is really close to my heart. And that's why I do this. I mean, obviously, you're doing your job also out of conviction. So it's just keep the conversation going and find someone you trust. And if you don't want to make content or you don't want to, write up a post or something, just share the information because and that was another thing that was talked about in this whole AI and warfare type of thing. These autonomous bots that can influence the algorithm in certain ways, certain messages are being pushed and not pushed. And it feels like a really hopeless losing battle, but sometimes it's empowering as a person. And it's great for democratic resilience just to do something. I have my own campaign about, boycotting companies that are still profiting off the war in Russia and paying profit taxes into the Kremlin's war chest. We know that the Kremlin's defense budget for 2025 is at 30%, and that means all of
Yeah.
these Western companies, there be Ritz Crackers or Ritter Sport or a lot of other Oreo, that they're in Russia. They're making Russians feel like their life is normal, and it's totally normal what's going on. Look, we still have our products and things like that. And because of that, these companies are making huge profits. And uh, these profits are being taxed, and they're basically paying for the missiles that are directed towards Kyiv. So, it's also good to know that you can just change your habits a little bit at the grocery store. Stop buying Ritz, stop buying Oreo.
Including, I'm assuming, some companies at the Munich Security Conference. A lot of this is done through third parties, through various countries. It's complicated to do. Boycotts and sanctions are difficult,
Yeah,
but
they are.
edge case, being able to communicate what can be done. We can't do anything about the black market, but we can do something about some consumer choices, of course. But
Yeah.
also, as far as communications goes, right now, a lot of the criticism that's being sent to in the Ukrainian direction right now is that in the wake of these criticisms from Vance, from Musk, from other people on the presidential team, Zelensky and others in Ukraine have responded much more defensively than they have in the past. And some people have referred to this as a mistake, or are the Europeans seeing this as a mistake? Or would you think that things could be done better, worse?
I think that for an actor, when you look at the pictures of Zelensky starting when the Secretary of the Treasury at Bassett, I think his name is Steve Bassett, I'm not quite sure, showed up on Bankova Street. You look at the pictures from throughout the days after that, even though President Zelensky has a history of being a really good actor, you could really see that on his face. And I think that was also a strategic move to let people see that he was not happy with the situation. Now, how Ukraine has been reacting politely and trying to, not ruffle any feathers for almost 3 years now. It's gonna be 3 years coming up in just a matter of days, since full-scale invasion began, and if there's nothing to lose anymore, I don't know if there's really a foundation for that criticism. I think the most important thing right now is that Ukrainians are showing that there's unity outward, right? That they're are underscoring this message that we can't have elections right now because it wouldn't be fair and free elections. We don't want to break law here. I think that's important. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't criticize President Zelensky domestically. I'm just saying that for the outward perception, I think the Ukrainian unity, especially on this hot topic right now, the elections, is important. Yeah, I have a tough time not empathizing with Zelensky. There's a huge gap between what's promised to Ukraine and what Ukraine actually gets. If there was going to be one silver lining from this contract, I had considered that 500 billion for rare earth metals might then allow Ukraine to be a paying customer and allocate money for what they wanted to, and to buy products that, they could use however they wanted, military products and defense things. I made that assessment before I really realized what a bum deal the Secretary of the Treasury had laid on Zelensky's desk.
Now there's a bunch of I just before this, for example, I saw accusations from state. I almost never mind. I'm confusing my titles of people between the European Forum and the American Forum. Secretary of State, not Minister Rubio, regarding basically accusing Zelensky of lying about their meetings and things. So this issue of political communication, it's all going very poorly right now, and it's hard to comment when we're in the middle of it. So I'll just do everyone a favor and move on from that, considering that by the time this is released in a few days, it could be an entirely different scenario. Yeah. But some of these other questions refer to some of the things that the Europeans might take part in as well, and might have been discussed at the security conference. And for example, this one refers to peacekeepers. And this was discussed at the meeting after the conference. So, one, are peacekeepers even on the table for Ukraine? And if so, would they be useful?
Depends on how effective they are, right?
Mhm.
No,
And I guess more so how this was discussed among the Europeans, more so than defense analysis here.
well, I said that Zelensky ended up giving the speech that Vance should have, because he talked about security the day after on the same stage. And Zelensky really tried hard to fill the gap. And he did talk about peacekeeping, but he talked about it both ways, right? He talked about Europeans being on Ukrainian soldier soil, but he also talked about how Ukrainian soldiers have the most experience of any right now in Europe to the current state of warfare. and that they could be helpful other places around Europe. And, right now we're looking at things where organized crime is being hired to do extrajudicial killings all over Europe. We've got drones flying over European barracks in Germany. That's happening. There are security issues that need to be looked into. And it actually might not be a bad thing. And now this wasn't discussed, but this is just me armchairing it. Where you get some Ukrainians to have a little bit of a break from the front line, and maybe they can do a turn of duty in Europe, and they're replaced with fresh peacekeepers. If it gets to that point, that could be beneficial for both groups. Right now, it's a tough sell though, and especially with the German election coming up, this idea that they might be sending troops somewhere, that's not going to get anybody elected in Germany. So they might strategically, at least in Germany, not be talking about that. Macron is offering troops to everyone, right? Didn't he say to Denmark he'd send some to Greenland if it was necessary? I can't recall him saying that he actually, I do, now that I think about it, think I caught a headline of him saying that they would not send any troops to Ukraine.
Yeah, we've been going back and forth on it. They initially suggested that they could send peacekeepers after some kind of peace agreement was reached. It's strange. The communications on that have been weird. Drone has kind of gotten more aggressive from time to time before pulling it back, I guess.
Yeah. It's almost interesting now, though, because now we're talking about how everyone seems to be playing a little bit into Putin's hand. The fact that now Macron said he's not going to send troops, that's something that Putin wanted to hear from him for a long time. Putin was trying to really get him to say that you're not going to do it. And Macron was being cute and not, you can't make me say that. And now he's come out and said it. So that's too bad.
So I think the term peacekeeper here is very important because what a peacekeeper is something very specific, and that's organized through the UN with the agreement of both parties and are mostly there for observe and report. Like they're not war fighters. They're there to.
So we should really talk about security guarantees, shouldn't we?
Yeah.
And it's easy to mix up these terms, and words matter.
Mhm.
And I think that's really what it comes down to. We need soldiers that will enforce security guarantees. And I don't know when the fighting stops, where the border is going to be. It's just that that's going to need to be protected. No one should be under any illusion that Russia's not going to try to advance if nobody's watching, as
Of
they've done so
course.
long.
And a peacekeeper won't do anything about that.
No, a peacekeeper can't. I mean, and these international organizations in the past 3 years have really, and you've done some things on this. You've talked about the Red Cross on your podcast. I listen to your podcast often when I'm gardening, so I have association with you and stubborn tree roots, Anthony.
For those listening, I also host a podcast, Ukraine Without Hype. We don't usually cross promote so much, but we're crossing some wires here. But yes, if you would like to go listen to Ukraine Without Hype, you can go to Ukraine Without Hype.
And you can cut that out, but
Leaving it in. Yeah, but the other issue with guarantees, though, is someone else asked about if Europe would be willing to do any guarantees. Let me go back to the exact wording of the question here because I thought it was interesting. Ukraine had already signed a defense agreement in 1991 with you and several others. Lots of various "we promise everything will be okay" agreements since then with the US. What guarantees could Ukraine possibly find acceptable?
Well, if there's one thing all these broken promises are good for, like the Budapest Memorandum, mentioning that is now really also in vogue, speaking of hot topics, is the fact that there's precedence. And Ukraine can say, no, we're not going to do it like this because we have all of these examples since 1991 where this didn't work. Maybe it's really trying to squeeze some lemonade out of the lemon there, but I was not privy to any conversations
Okay.
that people were able to say, we're going to do this and we need to do this. What I was aware of is really this idea now that people that didn't want to accept how high the threat was really realize we need to really step up, because if we're to believe what Vance and the Trump administration is saying, they're not going to help us. It might make things worse. and we got to get our ducks in a row.
And this last question regarding what Europeans might agree to, or reading the room of where they may stand as to Russia, the question of nuclear deterrence. This is a big one. Do you think that the Europeans might possibly extend nuclear deterrence to Ukraine? Or if so, how amenable would they be to Ukraine developing its own?
Tough question. It makes a lot of sense that Ukraine would want to do that. I don't see anyone supporting that because it is domestically in different European countries not something that the public really wants to embrace. And Russia has worked hard to get into topics and influence, these conversations about what that means very discreetly, indirectly. And a lot of people in that are in pacifist movements and things like that don't realize that they're really playing in the Kremlin's hand. In Germany, the French have no problem with nuclear, right? They've got
They
nuclear.
have extremely aggressive nuclear policy, actually. They have the more so than the US, more so than Russia. France nuclear policy is kind of scary if you read it, actually.
Yeah, and I mean we're all kind of okay with that, like, oh, the French can do that, but why wouldn't we do it for the Ukrainians? I don't know if Ukraine still doesn't have good enough PR in terms of things can shift so quickly. You get another color revolution. Who knows who's going to take over? That might be a flippant attitude there. I I think they're going to want to avoid that conversation. It's like they avoid a lot of the hard conversations, and they being the Europeans. It's it's tough right now. It's tough because I don't have answers for Ukraine. I can't say what Ukraine wants to hear, which would be, yeah, we're going to send boots on the ground. They're There are some people that really know that they're next, and, those are the people in terms of if Ukraine would fall, if
Mhm.
the borders get pushed, and those are the ones that are taking it seriously. But isn't that sad that you have to actually be in danger, wanna help somebody out, and it's really just self-serving?
Mhm.
Yeah, but Ukraine also has a history of experiencing that too.
And we'll close off with a question that I thought was quite intimidating, so we can lead off with that one. Long, so bear with me. What evidence could Trump and those in the blame Ukraine camp possibly be using to justify their position? What information are they citing to convince themselves Ukraine is at fault for Russia's invasion? And as a side, we're getting some news that at the G20, the next one that's coming up, America is resisting language of blaming Russia for aggression in Ukraine. So that's an aside from that question. What information could they be citing to convince themselves Ukraine is at fault for Russia's invasion? All evidence for the last 3, more like 10 years, suggests Russia started this conflict and that Ukraine is fighting for life, liberty, and truth, while Russia is fighting for power, fear, status, money, and resources. How do seemingly intelligent, powerful people believe this is Ukraine's fault? And he's asking this about the politics, but I would extend this to regular people who are nice when you meet them, seem plenty intelligent, but still fall for propaganda. I'm sure libraries can be written on this question, but go at it.
I'd say this is a classic example of 60/40 propaganda use, where there are people and platforms that develop a strong following and people trust them, and they start being misinformation to serve their own purposes. And research has shown that if we keep it under 40% bullshit, then people go like, that doesn't sound right. But, Anthony or Dr. K, they've always been honest in the past. So this must be right. So we're seeing some of that. We're also seeing the fear in the United States. You watch White House press conferences, and there are some very articulate journalists that are asking, as you said this to spokespeople or on the podium years, 3 or 4 years ago, and now you're saying this as a member of Trump's administration, and watching this dance of how they're pivoting without actually addressing how their opinion changed and how truth has changed. These people are really skilled, and the skill is also being used to get these messages out that are incorrect. I think we all feel like we're being a little bit gaslit, right? Like, what happened the last 3 years? What happened the last 10 years? Did you have to continue to push back? I mean, you'll remember, like, Putin, he regularly rewrites history. Do you remember when a South African delegation came to Kyiv? I think it was in the summer of 2023, and then they went on St. Petersburg, and he told it was this delegation from some of the BRICS countries, I want to say, that he had, tried to negotiate for peace already, and he held up, like, printout of something. And anyone following for the last couple years knew that he was rewriting history again. So this is history being rewritten. The thing is that the people that are in charge of the United States, they're drawing in a new audience who maybe isn't as in tune with this topic. So when they hear something that's incorrect for the first time, it's their truth. And we know that once someone has accepted something as truth,
The
it
anchoring
takes
is what it's called. Yeah.
yeah, and it takes 5, 6 times them to even question if the information they got initially, and you know what? We shouldn't be using the word information because that sounds fact-based. I like to use that only for fact-based we're talking about
Mm.
content. We're talking about messaging content here. They're getting fake news.
Content does sound like a slur. Yes.
What is content? I mean, you and I make content. Content is the umbrella. Information is the true part of content. I think we really need to start differentiating. And so, yeah, and I'm just as bad as White House spokespeople because I'm dancing around this topic. I don't know how to answer it. Yes, we are being gaslit, and people are trying to do it. And at some point, the Overton window of, like, what you can talk about and what you accept as truth, and everyone has their own truth. Things are getting crazy, and maybe we all need to stand in front of the mirror twice a day and say, Russia invaded Ukraine. Russia is the aggressor. And just maybe do that for our own mental health.
So that will conclude our questions, but we'll finish off with, do you have anything to plug? Do you have anything to direct people to? Charities? I don't know.
I would suggest that people keep giving to other people that are doing good things. Recently had a colleague from UATV who her husband was killed, now a young mother who never got a chance to see the baby. Things like that are important. That also connects people internationally with really the personal stories. You need to be respectful, not leverage off those things. But it's good to share those as an English speaker on social media. Is coming out of Ukraine. What else I want to plug is for everyone that wants to do their own research, make sure you're getting the right sources. There are lots of think tanks and research institutions that are really trying to make their information more accessible. You can read things like I'm a fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, they're close to Ukraine. They know the truth, I should say. And they do put out a lot of information that could be helpful. I just recently saw a 3-pager from the German Council on Foreign Relations. It's called the GGAP, which talks about why elections can't happen in Ukraine, which are really concise talking points. And those things are important because sometimes you're so overwhelmed with the change of the narrative and the reframing that it's good to know where resources are to back you up. And yeah, it's good also to let these institutions know that you're accessing their research. It's important for them to keep them going.
And what was your TikTok?
I'm Karistocracy on TikTok, and I talk about security and global affairs. The K was for knowledge, and the aristocracy was because it was a government thing. I thought it was cute. Maybe it's not the best branding. Karistocracy on TikTok. I'm Kari Oderman on Instagram. And I'm on all the other things too, but not quite as prolific. Not as big. Okay, we'll say it like that. Not as
Great. So thank you very much for coming on the show. Thank you very much to any of our watchers, our listeners. This will be going up as both a video and a podcast. So both there. Live viewers, thank you very much. And Slava Ukraini.